A brand new account gets treated like a stranger at the door, no matter how clean the setup behind it is. You can have a perfect anti-detect profile, a matched proxy, a fresh SIM, and none of it buys you instant trust. Because trust isn't something you configure. It's something an account earns one ordinary session at a time, the same way a new employee earns access on their first week rather than their first hour. This is the warm-up playbook, the actual practice of taking a day 1 account and turning it into a day 90 account without ever tripping the caution that every platform defaults to for anything new. It's slower than most people want to hear, and it's also the single highest leverage thing you can do for an account's long-term survival. For antidetect, a brand new account has zero history, and zero history means the platform has nothing to compare today's behavior against. It can't tell if a sudden burst of activity is a real person discovering the app for the first time, or a script standing up a fresh identity to replace one that just got banned yesterday. So the default posture toward day 1 is caution, not welcome, and that caution shows up as lower reach, more verification prompts, and tighter action limits than an aged account with the exact same profile details would ever see. The entire goal of a warm-up is closing that gap over time, deliberately, not skipping past it and hoping nobody notices. Profile completeness as a signal. An empty profile with no photo, no bio, and no details filled in reads as a shell standing up rather than a person settling in. Filling out a profile slowly across the first few sessions, adding a photo here, a bio line there, updating a location or a link as it would naturally occur to someone, reads completely differently than an account that shows up on day 1, fully complete in a single sitting. Real people build out their profile the way they build out anything new, gradually and a little inconsistently, revisiting it a week later to tweak something, not assembling it perfectly once and never touching it again. Daratoba. Dida. Activity that ramps gradually over days and weeks is what an organic adoption curve actually looks like. And it's the single biggest lever in the whole playbook. A new user who discovers a platform typically pokes around cautiously at first, does a little more the next day, and settles into a steady rhythm over 1 or 2 weeks. An account that goes from 0 to maximum daily actions on day 1 looks like nothing a real onboarding ever produces. And that mismatch alone is enough to draw attention regardless of how clean everything else about the account is. A reasonable curve might look like a handful of actions on day 1, roughly double that by the end of the first week, and full normal usage only by the second or third week, not the first afternoon. Ordinary session behavior. Warming up isn't only about the target action you eventually want the account to do. It's about everything around it too. Real sessions include ordinary browsing, scrolling past things that aren't the goal, spending a few minutes reading before doing anything at all. An account that logs in, performs one narrow action, and logs straight back out every single time looks like a tool executing a task, not a person spending idle time on an app. Building in that ordinary dwell time from the very first session is cheap, and it matters more than most people expect, because it's one of the easiest signals to fake convincingly, and one of the most commonly skipped, the follow or connect ramp. Connections should start small and spaced out. A handful of follows or adds in the first days, genuine engagement with whatever gets followed, then a gradual increase as the account ages into its second and third week. A burst of dozens of connections in the first hour looks exactly like a contact list was uploaded and processed by a script, because in a lot of cases that is literally what happened. Spacing this out and mixing in real interaction rather than pure connection volume is what separates an account building a network from an account executing a list against a target. An engagement quality over quantity. A like costs almost nothing and says almost nothing. A comment that responds to the actual content. A reply in a thread. A few extra seconds spent on a post before moving on. All say considerably more, and platforms weigh them differently for exactly that reason. An account that racks up hundreds of shallow likes and never once leaves a comment or lingers on anything looks like it's grinding through a checklist. Spending less time on more actions and more time on fewer better ones is a trade worth making, especially in the first few weeks when every action carries more weight against the thinner history. The messaging ramp. Direct messages deserve their own pace entirely, separate from following or posting, because unsolicited outbound messaging at volume is one of the most heavily scrutinized behaviors on almost any platform. A new account sending dozens of near-identical messages in its first days is about as clear a signal as exists that something automated or coordinated is running behind it. Holding off on any meaningful messaging volume until an account has weeks of ordinary varied activity behind it, and keeping the content of those messages genuinely different from each other rather than templated, matters more here than almost anywhere else in the playbook. Fingerprint and network consistency. One account should stay tied to one browser profile and one proxy for its entire warm-up, start to finish. Hopping an account between devices or swapping its assigned proxy mid-ramp reintroduces exactly the kind of inconsistency that gets an account flagged on its own. A login history that suddenly shows a different fingerprint or a different network without any believable reason behind the change. Keep the pairing stable through the whole warm-up window, and only revisit it later once the account has real age and a long, boring, consistent history behind it. Posting cadence. If the account posts content at all, the rhythm matters as much as the content itself. A normal cadence, spaced out the way an actual person's schedule would space it, reads very differently from batch posting a week's worth of content in one sitting, because that was when someone finally sat down to do it. Platforms watch posting intervals the same way they watch login intervals, and a suspiciously regular or suspiciously bursty pattern stands out against the far messier rhythm of a real person's actual week. Verification early. Adding phone and email verification in the first few sessions, rather than leaving an account unverified indefinitely, does real work. Verified accounts get more benefit of the doubt and more trust runway from day one, because verification itself is a small piece of friction that filters out a lot of throwaway setups before they even get started. It costs very little time to do early, and it quietly raises the ceiling on everything else in the warm-up that follows. Staggering the fleet. When you're warming up more than one account at a time, the accounts need to be staggered against each other, not just against a real user curve individually. A dozen profiles that all hit day 3, or all cross the same activity threshold in the same hour, recreate a timing correlation problem at the fleet level, even if each account looks perfectly fine on its own. Stagger start dates by days, stagger daily action windows by hours, and treat the fleet's overall rhythm as its own thing worth managing, separate from any single account's individual curve. Different platforms, different clocks. Not every platform runs the same clock on trust, and treating them all identically wastes either time or safety margin. A casual social account might earn reasonable trust in 2 or 3 weeks of ordinary use. An account tied to payments, selling, or advertising tends to sit under scrutiny for considerably longer, because the money attached to it raises the stakes on both sides. A platform that's publicly dealing with a wave of coordinated abuse will also tighten its default caution across the board for a while, which means the same warm-up pace that worked cleanly 6 months ago might need to run slower for a stretch. The playbook doesn't change, but the calendar it runs on does, and assuming a fixed number of days works everywhere is how people get caught out. The danger zone actions. Some actions are simply riskier to take early, regardless of how well warmed up the account otherwise looks. Mass messaging, aggressive following at volume, and changing payment or recovery details are the moves worth delaying until an account has real age behind it. These are exactly the actions most associated with abuse when they show up on a new account, so they're also the ones that draw the most scrutiny by far, and pushing them a few weeks later costs very little compared to what triggering them early on a thin history can cost. When a warm-up gets interrupted, sometimes a restriction or a verification prompt shows up mid-ramp anyway, and the instinct is to push through it immediately. Resist that instinct. Treat an unexpected restriction as a signal to slow the pace down, rather than a wall to force through with more activity, since forcing through it usually reads as exactly the kind of persistence a coordinated setup would show. A short pause, a slower resumed pace, and genuinely ordinary activity in between recovers an account's trajectory far more often than pushing harder does. Reading the feedback signals. A warm-up isn't something you set and forget. It's something you watch continuously. Engagement rate holding steady or dropping. Restriction notices appearing where none used to show up before. CAPTCHA challenges appearing more often than they did the week before. These are the account quietly telling you whether the current pace is working or pushing too hard, and adjusting the ramp down when you see them beats plowing ahead and finding out the hard way 3 weeks later. Underneath every piece of this, the actual product being sold here is time plus consistency, not a clever trick that skips the wait entirely. There is no shortcut that removes the calendar from the equation. And anyone promising an instant warm-up is really promising a faster path to getting flagged sooner rather than later. The accounts that hold up long-term are, without exception, the ones that were never in a hurry in the first place. And the operators who do this well tend to think in fleets and in weeks, not in single accounts and single afternoons. I run this exact playbook across real cloud phones and real proxy-backed profiles because staggering dozens of accounts by hand doesn't scale past a handful. And getting the ramp wrong on a fleet gets expensive fast, both in lost accounts and lost time rebuilding them. Multi-account ops. Com has the full written version of this warm-up schedule along with the cloud phone and proxy setups I actually pair it with. Tested on real accounts I run myself, rather than theorized on a forum somewhere. If you're building a fleet instead of just one account, that's where to start. Subscribe for more honest, tested multi-account ops. Next time, antidetect browser versus cloud phone versus proxy. What each one actually isolates, and why buying just one of them isn't the fix people think it is.